They were driving home through the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest after a long day of logging when a glowing disk appeared in the clearing ahead, and when Travis jumped from the truck to get a closer look, a beam of light struck him down. What happened next became the most controversial alien abduction case in history, with 7 witnesses and a 5-day disappearance that divided a small Arizona town. It was November 5, 1975, a Wednesday evening in the mountains of northeastern Arizona, and the crew of 7 loggers was finishing another exhausting day of thinning trees in the national forest. Travis Walton was 22 years old, a wiry young man with shoulder-length brown hair and a stubborn streak that his friends knew well. He worked as part of a logging crew contracted to clear sections of forest, hard physical labor that paid decent money for young men willing to work long hours in remote wilderness. The crew consisted of Travis, his best friend Mike Rogers, who was the crew boss, and 5 other men: Alan Dallas, Dwayne Smith, John Goulet, Kenneth Peterson, and Steve Pierce, all local guys from the small towns around Snowflake and Taylor, Arizona. They had been working together for weeks, developing the easy camaraderie that comes from shared labor and long days in the woods. On this particular evening, they finished work around 6 o'clock as twilight descended over the ponderosa pine forest, the temperature dropping quickly as it always did in the high-elevation mountains. They loaded their tools into Mike Rogers' truck, an International Harvester crew cab pickup that could fit all 7 men, and began the long drive back down the mountain toward town. The dirt logging road wound through dense forest, and as they came around a bend into a clearing, Mike slammed on the brakes so hard that the men in the back were thrown forward. There, hovering about 15 feet above the ground just beyond the road, was a glowing, disc-shaped object approximately 15 to 20 feet in diameter, perfectly silent and radiating a yellowish-orange light that illuminated the entire clearing. The craft appeared to be made of metal, smooth and seamless, with a dome on top and what looked like panels or segments around its circumference. The men sat frozen in shock, staring at the impossible object floating in front of them, none of them believing what their eyes were seeing. Travis Walton, sitting in the passenger seat, reacted first with characteristic impulsiveness. Before anyone could stop him, he opened the truck door and jumped out, striding quickly toward the hovering craft with a mixture of curiosity and reckless bravery that his friends knew well as typical Travis behavior. Mike Rogers shouted at him to get back in the truck, but Travis ignored him, walking closer to the object with his eyes fixed on its glowing surface. He got to within about 20 feet of the craft when it suddenly began to wobble slightly, making a high-pitched sound that several of the men later described as similar to turbine engines spooling up. Travis stopped walking and stood still, perhaps finally realizing the danger he had put himself in, when a brilliant blue-green beam of light shot out from the bottom of the craft and struck him squarely in the chest with such force that it lifted him off his feet and threw him backward through the air. He crashed to the ground and lay motionless, and the 6 men remaining in the truck panicked completely. Mike Rogers threw the truck into reverse and gunned the engine, backing up rapidly before spinning around and racing down the mountain road at dangerous speeds, branches scraping the sides of the truck as the men inside screamed and argued about what they had just witnessed. They drove about a quarter mile before Mike slammed on the brakes again, and in the sudden silence, broken only by their heavy breathing and the ticking of the hot engine, the reality of what they had done hit them. They had left Travis behind, possibly dead or dying, and regardless of what had happened, they couldn't just abandon him in the forest. After heated debate that lasted only a minute but felt like an eternity, Mike turned the truck around and drove slowly back to the clearing, every man terrified of what they might find. When they reached the spot where Travis had fallen, he was gone. The craft was gone. There was no sign of either, just the dark clearing, illuminated by their headlights, and the deepening twilight, with no indication that anything unusual had happened there, except for the 7 men's racing hearts and trembling hands. They searched the immediate area, calling Travis's name, looking for any sign of him or the object, but found nothing. The forest was silent except for the wind in the pines and the distant call of a night bird. After 20 minutes of fruitless searching, with darkness closing in completely, the men made the decision to drive into town and report what had happened to the authorities, knowing how insane their story would sound, but having no alternative. They arrived at the Navajo County Sheriff's Office in Holbrook around 7:30 that evening. 6 men talking over each other, clearly terrified and agitated, telling a story about a UFO and a missing logger that sounded like something out of a science fiction movie. The deputy on duty, Chuck Ellison, listened with growing skepticism as Mike Rogers tried to explain what they had witnessed. Ellison had known most of these men for years. They were local guys, not troublemakers or known liars, but their story was impossible to believe.
Still, a man was missing, and that required investigation, regardless of the circumstances. Sheriff Marlin Gillespie was called in, and within hours a search and rescue operation was organized. By midnight, dozens of volunteers with flashlights and dogs were combing the forest where the men indicated Travis had disappeared, while the 6 witnesses were separated and questioned individually by deputies and later by state police detectives. The stories from all 6 men were remarkably consistent, despite being given separately, which troubled investigators who knew that fabricated stories typically showed more variation. Each man described the glowing disc, the beam of light, Travis struck down, their panicked flight, and their return to find him gone. Their emotional state was genuine. They were clearly traumatized by something, showing signs of shock and distress that would be difficult to fake. But the story itself was so outlandish that law enforcement had to consider the possibility that the men had harmed Travis themselves and concocted the UFO story to cover it up. The 6 loggers were given polygraph examinations over the following days, administered by Cy Gilson, an experienced examiner with the Arizona Department of Public Safety. 5 of the 6 men passed their polygraph tests, showing no deception when stating they had witnessed a UFO and seen Travis struck by a beam of light. One man, Alan Dallas, showed inconclusive results due to his extreme emotional state, but there was no indication of deception, just overwhelming anxiety and fear. The polygraph results complicated the investigation significantly because they suggested the men genuinely believed what they were reporting, even if the story seemed impossible. The search for Travis Walton continued for 5 days, involving dozens of volunteers, tracking dogs, helicopters, and law enforcement officers from multiple agencies. They searched hundreds of acres of mountainous forest terrain, finding no trace of the missing logger. No blood, no clothing, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate what had happened to him. The forest had simply swallowed him completely, or he had been taken somewhere the searchers couldn't follow. The national media descended on Snowflake, Arizona, a tiny Mormon farming community that suddenly found itself at the center of the biggest UFO story in years. Reporters interviewed the 6 witnesses, Travis's family, local residents, and anyone with an opinion about what might have happened. The town divided into believers who accepted the logger's story and skeptics who insisted there had to be a rational explanation, possibly murder hidden behind a fantastic tale. Travis's mother, Mary Walton, appeared on television pleading for her son's safe return, her face lined with worry and exhaustion, insisting that the men were telling the truth and that Travis had been taken by something beyond human understanding. On the night of November 10th, 5 days after Travis disappeared, Mike Rogers received a phone call at his home around midnight. The voice on the line was Travis, weak and confused, saying he was at a phone booth at a gas station in Heber, Arizona, about 30 miles from where he had vanished. He was disoriented and frightened, begging Mike to come get him immediately and not to bring anyone else. Mike grabbed Travis's brother Dwayne and his brother-in-law Grant Neff, and they drove at high speed to the gas station, arriving within 45 minutes to find Travis huddled in the phone booth, shaking and incoherent. He had lost about 10 pounds, his face was gaunt and pale, and he was wearing the same clothes he had disappeared in, though they were strangely clean considering he had supposedly been in the forest for 5 days. They brought him home without immediately notifying authorities, wanting to get him medical attention and hear his story privately before subjecting him to the media circus that had engulfed the town. Over the next hours and days, Travis gradually recalled what had happened to him, though his memories were fragmented and traumatic. He remembered the beam of light striking him, a sensation of intense energy and pain, then blackness. The next thing he remembered was waking up lying on his back on what felt like a metal table, his body aching and his vision blurry. As his eyes focused, he saw a curved ceiling above him, smooth and metallic, with indirect lighting that had no visible source. He turned his head and nearly screamed when he saw 3 figures standing near him, short beings about 5 feet tall, with large heads, pale skin, and enormous dark eyes that dominated their faces. They wore tight-fitting tan or brown garments, and their features were delicate and strange, neither quite human nor entirely alien, with small noses, thin mouths, and no visible ears. Travis panicked and tried to sit up, his body responding sluggishly as if drugged. The beings backed away slightly but didn't flee, their large eyes watching him with what seemed like clinical interest rather than emotion.
If you're finding Travis Walton's incredible story as fascinating as thousands of others have, please subscribe to America's UFO Legacy, because we bring you these meticulously researched true UFO encounters every week, preserving the most important cases from the golden age of sightings, and your support helps us continue this important work of documenting American history that mainstream sources often ignore. Travis swung his legs off the table and stood unsteadily, looking around the room for anything he could use as a weapon. He spotted a clear tube, a rod on a nearby surface, and grabbed it, brandishing it at the three beings who retreated toward a doorway. Travis followed them, shouting incoherently, his fear turning to aggressive panic as he stumbled after them through corridors that curved and twisted in ways that hurt his eyes to follow. The beings disappeared through a doorway, and as Travis approached, a human figure appeared, a tall man wearing a tight blue uniform and a clear helmet or bubble over his head. This human didn't speak, but gestured for Travis to follow him, and Travis, exhausted and terrified, complied, hoping this person would provide answers or a way to escape. The man led Travis through more corridors into a larger room that appeared to be some kind of hangar or docking bay, where Travis could see several other disc-shaped craft similar to the one that had struck him in the forest. The scale of the space suggested he was in a much larger vessel or facility, something massive beyond what he had first imagined. The human figure led him to a chair and gestured for him to sit, then placed what looked like a clear mask over Travis's face. Travis tried to resist, but was too weak, and as he breathed whatever atmosphere was flowing through the mask, his consciousness began to fade, the room spinning around him as darkness closed in once more. The next thing Travis consciously remembered was lying on his back on cold pavement, staring up at a dark sky filled with stars. He sat up and realized he was on a highway, and as he looked around in confusion, he saw lights in the distance and staggered toward them, eventually finding the gas station where he called Mike Rogers. Everything between putting on the mask and waking on the pavement was blank, a void in his memory that would never be fully recovered despite later attempts at hypnotic regression. The 5 days he had been missing had passed for everyone else, but for Travis, conscious memory accounted for perhaps 2 hours at most, leaving a gap of missing time similar to other abduction cases but on a much larger scale. When Travis's reappearance was announced, the media frenzy intensified. He was immediately subjected to medical examinations, polygraph tests, psychological evaluations, and endless interviews by investigators, researchers, reporters, and curiosity seekers. The physical examination showed he was dehydrated and had lost weight, but there were no unusual marks, scars, or injuries that would indicate where he had been or what had happened to him. Blood tests showed nothing abnormal. He was psychologically distressed, but showed no signs of psychosis or delusion. The polygraph test administered several days after his return showed deception, which skeptics seized upon as proof the entire story was a hoax. But Travis's supporters pointed out that he was still traumatized and emotionally unstable when tested, conditions known to produce unreliable polygraph results. A second polygraph administered years later by a different examiner showed no deception. The controversy surrounding the Travis Walton case has never fully resolved, making it one of the most debated UFO incidents in history. Skeptics have proposed numerous alternative explanations over the decades. Some suggested Travis and the crew staged the entire event to get out of their logging contract, which they were running behind on and facing financial penalties for not completing on time. However, this theory required all 7 men to maintain a complex lie for decades, to pass or show inconclusive results on polygraphs, and to subject themselves to ridicule and scrutiny that damaged their reputations and personal lives. The financial motive was weak,
as they would have been better off simply admitting they couldn't complete the contract rather than creating an elaborate UFO hoax that brought them fame but little fortune.
The most creative skeptical theory suggested Travis and Mike Rogers had ingested hallucinogenic drugs, saw the planet Jupiter low on the horizon, and Travis had a bad trip that caused him to run into the forest where he remained disoriented for 5 days before wandering back to civilization. This theory also failed to account for the other 5 witnesses who saw the same thing, the lack of any evidence of drug use in subsequent medical tests, or the implausibility of Travis surviving in the wilderness for 5 days in an altered state. Supporters of Travis's account pointed to elements that strengthened his credibility. His description of the aliens matched other abduction accounts from people who had never heard of Travis Walton, suggesting either a genuine common experience or a collective cultural myth that somehow produced consistent details across independent witnesses. The presence of 7 witnesses to the initial encounter made the case unique among abduction reports, which typically involved solitary experiencers with no corroboration. The passing of polygraph examinations by the witnesses, while not conclusive proof, suggested they genuinely believed what they reported. Most significantly, Travis and the other witnesses never significantly profited from their experience. Indeed, it brought them mostly ridicule, suspicion, and personal hardship, removing the usual motive for perpetrating a hoax. In the decades since the incident, all 7 men have maintained their basic account despite pressure to recant, with the original 6 witnesses continuing to insist they saw Travis struck by a beam of light from a hovering disk. Several of them gave deathbed interviews in later years, stating emphatically that everything they reported was true and they stood by their testimony until the end. Travis himself wrote a book about his experience, The Walton Experience, later retitled Fire in the Sky, which became the basis for a 1993 Hollywood film that dramatized the event. The movie took significant creative liberties with Travis's account, particularly in depicting the aliens as more grotesque and the abduction as more terrifying than Travis remembered, changes made for dramatic effect that unfortunately confused public understanding of what Travis actually claimed happened. Travis has spent his life since the incident, giving lectures, appearing at UFO conferences, and defending his account against skeptics while trying to live a normal life in Arizona. He has repeatedly stated that he wishes the experience had never happened, that it derailed his life plans and subjected him to scrutiny and suspicion he never wanted. His consistency over 50 years, his willingness to submit to testing, and his obvious discomfort with fame suggest a man telling the truth as he remembers it, though whether that truth involves actual extraterrestrial abduction or some other explanation remains disputed. The Travis Walton case has been analyzed by researchers and investigators using every tool available, from polygraph tests to psychological evaluations to attempts at hypnotic regression. Some researchers believe it represents genuine alien abduction, possibly the best documented case on record due to the multiple witnesses. Others see it as mass hysteria, a shared delusion triggered by seeing something unusual but terrestrial that their minds interpreted as a UFO. Still others suspect an elaborate hoax that somehow succeeded beyond the perpetrator's wildest expectations and became impossible to abandon without facing serious legal and social consequences. The truth, as with most complex UFO cases, probably lies somewhere in the details that will never be fully known. The impact on the small Arizona communities where the witnesses lived was profound and lasting. Families were divided by the controversy, with some supporting the men and others branding them liars or worse. The logging crew's reputation suffered, making it difficult for some of them to find work in an industry where reliability and honesty were essential. Relationships fractured under the strain of constant media attention and public skepticism. Yet the witnesses stuck together,
supporting each other through the decades of questions and accusations, their shared experience bonding them in ways that outside observers could never fully understand. Mike Rogers, the crew boss whose truck the men were riding in that night, suffered perhaps the most professionally, as the UFO incident destroyed his logging business and reputation in the tight-knit forestry community. He has expressed frustration over the years that an encounter that lasted less than a minute derailed his entire career and changed his life permanently. Yet he has never wavered in his account, insisting that what happened to Travis was real, witnessed by 6 other men, and unexplainable by conventional means. The scientific community has largely ignored or dismissed the Travis Walton case, as it does with most UFO reports, preferring to focus on phenomena that can be studied in controlled conditions with repeatable results. The nature of UFO encounters, unique events that occur without warning and leave little physical evidence, makes them unsuitable for traditional scientific investigation. This creates a frustrating situation where potentially important phenomena are dismissed as unscientific without being properly studied, while demands for scientific proof can never be met using conventional methods. A few scientists have taken the case seriously, noting that the multiple witness aspect and the extensive investigation that followed make it worthy of consideration, even if no definitive conclusions can be drawn. The case raises broader questions about the nature of evidence, belief, and truth in modern society. How do we evaluate claims that seem impossible but come from apparently credible witnesses? What weight do we give to polygraph tests, which are imperfect tools that can be fooled or produce false results, yet provide some indication of sincerity? How do we explain consistent accounts from multiple independent witnesses when those accounts describe events that violate our understanding of what is possible? These questions extend beyond ufology into philosophy, psychology, and epistemology, touching on fundamental issues of how we know what we know and what we're willing to accept as real. As we look back on the Travis Walton case 50 years after it occurred, we're left with an unsolved mystery that continues to divide opinion. 7 men drove into the forest on a November evening, and 6 drove out, with a 7th missing for 5 days, before returning to civilization with a story of alien abduction that would define the rest of his life. The evidence is inconclusive. The testimony is compelling but unverifiable, and the truth remains elusive despite decades of investigation. What actually happened to Travis Walton in the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest in 1975? We may never know with certainty, but the case remains one of the most fascinating and controversial in UFO history, a story that challenges our assumptions and forces us to confront the possibility that reality might be stranger than we're comfortable admitting.
Before we close this extraordinary account, I want to ask you, what's your take on the Travis Walton case? Do you believe 7 men witnessed an alien abduction? Or is there another explanation that makes more sense? Could this many people maintain a lie for 50 years? Or did something genuinely unexplainable happen in that Arizona forest? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these complex cases benefit from different perspectives, and I read every single comment to understand how people interpret these mysterious events.